Mackenzie Postdoctoral Fellow in the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne. Her research interests are gender and feminism and trauma and memory in Indonesian modern and contemporary art. Following that, we have Sirait, who studied art history, intercultural communication, and psychology at the Ludwig Maximilian University and Leiden University. As a PhD candidate at LMU, her research interest lies in contemporary art practices from Indonesia, who studied art history, intercultural communication, and psychology at the Ludwig Maximilian University and Leiden University. We have Anida Yoeu, as a PhD candidate at LMU, her research interest lies in contemporary art practices from Indonesia that deploy performative strategies in the archive exhibition downstairs. And last but Ali is an artist whose work spans performance, installation, video, images, public encounters, and political agitation. She's a first-generation Muslim Khmer woman born in Cambodia and raised in Chicago. Ali is an artist whose work spans performance, installation, video, images, independent encounters, artist-run media lab in Phnom Penh. She's a first-generation Muslim Khmer woman born in Cambodia and raised in Chicago. As we've shown downstairs, founding member and collaborative has also been exhibited around the world. She's Phnom Penh an independent international artist-run media lab in Phnom Malaysia Heritage Center, Singapore, a lot of multidisciplinary London, of which the Buddhist Burger Asian Art Triennale. And I believe it was also been exhibited around the world in Phnom Penh galleries. Without further ado, just welcome my first speaker up here. Malaysia Heritage Center, Singapore, Southeast Asia Arts Fest London, and the 5th Kokoka Asian Art Triennale. And I believe it was also APT 8, right? Anida, yeah. So, okay, without further ado, just welcome my first speaker up here. Thank you.
Good afternoon, and I'd first like to thank Haus Kunst, and also Eva and Annie for bringing us all together in this space. It's amazing to see the familiar faces and also making new friends. And congratulations to Damien, Eva, and Annie for the very stimulating archival exhibition downstairs. Now, my talk today will talk about the issues of memory and archive in the works of an Indonesian artist, FX Harsono. It's quite interesting in the last since yesterday, we've heard the terms memory and history and trauma kind of being discussed in passing. Clearly, in Nora's keynote lecture and also in May's keynote this morning. So for my presentation, I'd like to kind of invite you to kind of look at the case studies and how an Indonesian artist actually work with these issues, specifically thinking about his identity as a Chinese Indonesian and how to kind of link it to the issues of representation and historical violence in Indonesia. Before I start, I also like to acknowledge the works of two of my colleagues, Amanda Rath and Thomas Berghaus, whose work on performance art kind of formed the foundation of thinking about performativity and performance art in Indonesia. Okay. This way? Okay, this way. All right. So the May 1998 anti-Chinese riots are pivotal to post-New Order Chinese trauma narrative, not only because it is the most recent major episode of anti-Chinese violence in Indonesia, but also because the tragedy brought a stark realization among Chinese Indonesians that, I quote, the assimilation project had indeed failed, unquote, from Gemma Purdy. Gemma Purdy, a scholar in Chinese Indonesians, argues that the anti-Chinese violence of May 1998 incited among the Chinese Indonesians a sense of renewed awareness of the inevitability of their ethnicity and particularly their vulnerability in Indonesia, no matter how hard they try to assimilate. Now, in the absence of facts of past episodes of anti-Chinese violence, oral history and hearsay play an essential part in how contemporary Chinese Indonesians remember their past. Today, almost every Chinese family has a story about a past anti-Chinese attack that a member of the close or extended family had supposedly personally experienced. The details and time frames of the stories vary. from accounts of family members who had evacuated their shops and homes during the May 1998 riots, to harsh rumors about the disappearances of politically rogue former neighbors and acquaintances during the anti-communist purge in 1965. In the majority of these stories, the facts were murky and unverifiable. Now, this paper will examine the works of FX Harsono, in particular how his performance works remember and perform history and trauma of Chinese Indonesians in the post-New Order era, in the relative absence of acknowledgement and memorialization of the violence from the state. Contemporary artists such as FX Harsono play an important role as memorials, the works of contemporary artists. The paper also explores Harsono's performances in mediating collective histories of trauma, more precisely how his two works, Korban, or Burnt Victims, and Rewriting the Erased, attempt to arrest, repeat, and rehearse traumatic effects as a means of creating cultural memory. Franciscus Saverius Harsono was born in 1949 in Blitar, East Java. He is one of the foremost contemporary Indonesian artists with a career that has spanned over 4 decades. Harsono's diverse body of work, from painting to installation and performance art, showed his strong interest in the intersection between artistic practices and social activism. He was initially trained as a painter in Indonesian Art Institute, or ISI, formerly ASRI Yogyakarta, between 1969 and 1974, before moving to Jakarta Art Institute in 1987. He currently lives and works in Jakarta. During the early years of his career, Harsono stated that his Chineseness was never really talked about. While his peers were aware that Harsono is of ethnic Chinese background, he himself preferred to keep a low profile over it. He stated that keeping a low profile was something considered to be natural for many Chinese Indonesians during the New Order. Moreover, despite his involvement in the progressive Indonesian New Art movement from 1975 to 1987, and his individual practice as an artist, Harsono rarely engaged with his Chinese Indonesian identity until 1998. So the anti-Chinese riots of 1998 changed his perspective, and from there on, Harsono has consistently created a series of works that explore the issues of politics, memory, and Chinese Indonesian identity in Indonesia. His first work that brought up the subject matter was the performance titled Korban, or Burnt Victims, that he performed on 18 October 1998 during his solo exhibition at Cemeti Art House. In a disused construction site, the artist arranged 9 human torsos made of wood that was attached on steel poles and planted to the ground. Harsono then introduced himself and explained to the audience that he wanted to show the processes behind his installation. However, as he stated, he realized that it was equally important to show the audience how his works responded to the current happenings in Jakarta. So the anti-Chinese riots happened across 3 major cities in Java and one in Medan as well. So this happened between the weeks 13th to 14th of May. And this this performance was in October, so quite a relatively short time. So to the performance, he brought out 5 picket signs and proceeded to tell the audience about the challenges in finding out the truth about what happened during the riots. During the speech, on every second sentence, Harsono pulled out the signs one by one, punctuating his narrative until 4 signs were placed opposite the torsos. Written on the signs were the words rusuh, riot, kerusuhan, rioting, dibuat rusuh, the riot was made up, rekayasa agar rusuh, the riot was manipulated. He then burned the signs one by one with a torch gun before he continued to burn the torsos. When one of the signs have turned into ashes, he pulled out the last sign that stated, siapa yang bertanggung jawab, who was responsible. As he walked with his knees bent along the line of the burning torsos and slowly lowered himself to the ground carrying the last sign, while saying, we lowered ourselves until we nearly crawled to the ground to ask this question, but we will never know who was responsible and how many victims were out there. The performance ended with these questions in the air as the artist left the site. The next scene in the documentation showed the artist return to the site and proceeded to burn the torsos until they were deeply blackened. Further photographic documentation showed the torsos were displayed horizontally within steel frames. And each frame of the torsos was accompanied by a pair of shoes in the gallery space. The installation, the performance installation, represented the multiple temporal frames in representing the violence of May 1998. The objects in the installations reference the harrowing stories of many people trapped in their own home and stores during the burning and looting that occurred in May 1998. As an installation and aftermath of the performance, the torsos, the steel frames, and the shoes, when juxtaposed together, function as both testimony and ultimately a memorial for the victims. The installation thus arrested the past to ensure that the present remembered the violence. For those who watched the live performance, however, were subjected to multisensory experience outside the visual perimeter, as I talked to those who witnessed the live performance. The audience experience of the riots through the smell of petrol, burning wood, smoke, and heat was provided by a work of art. The performance furnished a medium of confrontation with these violent actions, where the artist recreated the violence that was suggestive as a cathartic release from the collective shock that many Indonesians experienced during the time. The performance rehearsed traumatic affects through what Dominic Lacapra termed as acting out. In this regard, the artist's performance of acting out was necessary as a path to working through, primarily because the artist's anger and unapologetic demand for justice in his performance were in contrast with the observation made by scholars of Chinese Indonesians. Ian Ang, in her 2001 essay, suggests that the discourse of victimization among Chinese Indonesians is such that there is a paralyzing sense of being eternally victimized within the community, resulting in a profound sense of unjust victimization for which there was apparently no clear, livable explanation, no story to tell, except through the discourse of victimhood itself, unquote. For Chinese Indonesians, traumatic memories of the collective past continue to haunt the present, partly because until today, no perpetrator of past instances of anti-Chinese violence has ever been brought to justice. However, far from being surprised or outraged by this lack of justice, the majority of Chinese Indonesians accept it as normal. They're accustomed to unpunished acts of violence, and fending for themselves in times of crisis is thus regarded as a key to their survival in Indonesia. Now, the installations has since traveled to various exhibition venues since the artist first created it in 1998. It was first shown in Chemati in 1998, Singapore in 2001. Let me see about the show. Okay. Jakarta 2015, and in New York 2018. The installation and the recording of the performance became one of the artist's iconic works in the late 1990s, as well as cemented its function as a memorial for the victims of anti-Chinese riots in May 1998. Now, as the artist grew more comfortable in exploring his Chinese-Indonesian background and history of Chinese Indonesians in general, he began to produce more works that engage with the subject matter quite intensely. Since 2009, the artist has collected a large number of archival documentations in the form of objects, photographs, oral history, and identity papers that related to Chinese Indonesian history, and utilized these archival materials in his performance and installation works. According to Harsono, the archival material function as an index or as traces of memory that have the potential to destabilize history or disrupt remembrance. Now, the following work introduced one of the central themes of his recent works, namely the politics of loss and erasure in recorded history. Rewriting the erased. Video performance that was first shown in the artist 2009, The Erased Time in Jakarta. Now, in the performance, the artist sat in a darkened room writing Chinese characters on a piece of paper. When he was done, he stood up and took the piece of paper and laid it on the floor. He repeated the actions until he formed a neat grid of 11 by 11 pieces. After the artist placed the final piece of paper, he went back to his desk. The screen went black. The next scene showed up the artist got up from the desk and starting to collect the pieces systematically, kneeling on the floor and tidying up as he went along. The video ended with the artist back on his desk with a neat pile of paper in front of him. The neat grid and the stack of paper are in themselves hinted of the archival practices of gathering, classification, and identification, while simultaneously the utilization of these markers also suggestive of the bureaucratic horror and systematic discrimination that many Chinese Indonesians experienced during the New Order regime. As the artist began to write on the piece of paper and repeated the action, the viewer is struck by the earnestness of this delivery. As Christine Clark observed, what is affecting is the obvious loss and intense demonstration of will. The awkwardness and the lack of calligraphic fluency is defined by the unreserved attempt to reclaim the lost past. The lost past that Clark referred here is one of the central trauma narrative in Chinese Indonesians' long history of violence and discrimination, namely the New Order regulation in changing the names. The Chinese characters that the artist wrote over and over again was his Chinese name, or Honggun, and as he stated, the only Chinese characters that I know. In contrast to his previously discussed performance and installation work Korban or Burn Victims that draws the audience into the work through the traumatic representation of violence. Rewriting the Erase is a reflective piece that drew from an unshareable trauma as it focuses on repetition, as the repetition of actions measures the passage of times and thus demarcates a linear chronology. At the same time, the repeated actions that emerge from a traumatic subjectivity also produces a circular experience, an intrusive re-experiencing that suggests the deconstruction of temporal linearity. The performance also embodied both the acting out that draws attention to the oppressive historical repetition of discriminations for Chinese Indonesians and a self-conscious working through of a personal as well as collective trauma. Harsono's performances also have the capacity to convey the means and effects by which spectator bodies become responsible and responsive to the histories of trauma. The artist has stated that his body is a mere conduit and that his performances are intended to transfer the emotional content of an object to the audience. To place Harsono's statement in context, as part of Indonesia's experimental group, the Indonesian New Art Movement, where Thomas and Amanda have discussed yesterday, Harsono's practice reflected the core aesthetic of the group, namely the focus on objects. So turning away from the conservatism of art academies during that time that focuses on painting and sculpture in the 1970s, the New Art Movement did not seek to represent an emotional response in a painting or sculpture. Instead, they sought to invoke the emotional response of the viewer through utilizing the object as part of the art making. Now looking at the video of Korban or Burn Victims 20 years later, the documentation still delivers a sense of shock from the violence represented in the works. Within the exhibition space of Korban, the audience is invited to visually invest in an imaginative reconstruction of the site of trauma, as well as to complete the image of loss in the site. As the objects are staged to recall those who have been killed, the physical body of the visitor remediates the absent bodies that comprise the scene of trauma through their proximity and interaction with the art objects in the exhibition space. The audience are thus allowed to feel about the past in a process that performs the non-recuperability of memory while also transmitting it. In rewriting the erased, the repetition of the artist's gesture induces a peaceful rhythm that masks the personal and collective trauma of the subject matter. In this work, the artist added a new layer, namely by situating an aesthetic concern over the socio-political content. As the artist's body becomes a mean of articulation for the corporeal processes of sensing a past, and the intensities of emotion, sensation, or sentiment that might arrive through this process, the affect draws into focus memories affective dimensions to recreate a new cultural memory. Now, Harsono's work thus acknowledged the complexity of feeling that follows from the destructive mass violence, both cyclical and social. I thought I'll add the presentation with this work here. Just rather as a postscript, somewhat belatedly in 2017, the then Jakarta governor, who who is of Chinese-Indonesian background, opened a monument dedicated to the victims of the mass violence in a public cemetery. So what you see there is a large sculpture and situated amongst the graves of the unidentifiable victims of the violence. So the monument is a result of a long campaign by Komnas Perempuan, the National Commission on Violence Against Women, which is an independent institution established in 1998 to deal with fundamental human rights of women in Indonesia, to remember the victim of the rights of violence. However, it was really interesting that there are two plaques in this monument. So in the post-New Order desire for reconciliation and moving forward, the then Jakarta governor stated in his plaque that this monument is to remember the victims of violence, and hopefully that we can move forward to a better democratic Indonesia. So in his statement, he didn't acknowledge that there are victims, that there are women, Chinese-Indonesian women who were raped and experienced sexual assault during those times. The Komnas Perempuan, the Women's Commission, pushed back, and so they inserted their own version of the plaque at the bottom of the monument there, and explicitly said that there are women who experience sexual assault and rape during this. So even within a monument that's supposed to be kind of acknowledged by the state or the city of Jakarta, there was still a tension in terms of understanding and looking at the memories of past violence. And I shall end up here. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Before I start, I want to say, being based in Munich, I'm of course particularly thankful to Eva, Annie, and Damien, and Haus der Kunst and Goethe-Institut for putting together this great program and bringing all these amazing scholars, artists, and curators to Munich. And I also want to emphasize that I'm presenting parts of my work that is still in progress, and I'm be very happy about any kind of feedback or input. Rebuilding Space, Body and Time, Alienation and Appropriation in Marintan Sirait's Performative Practice. In this talk, I will present parts of my PhD project. My research focuses on contemporary artistic practices from Indonesia, which deploy performative strategies and relate to questions of otherness or alienness. Today, I will focus on the performative practice of pioneering Indonesian artist Marintan Sirait, especially her performance installation piece called Building a House. The piece stands out by asking existential questions surrounding the self and the body with its relation to the world, a specific approach that was once described as non-political activism. In this talk, I will present Marintan Sirait's Building a House as an embodied expression of and resistance to the experience of alienation. I will first contextualize Marintan's practice regarding the New Order's government policies in Indonesia. The New Order, a term that was coined by President Suharto himself, was a repressive regime that lasted from 1966 till 1998. By legislation and propagated ideas, the regime tried to intervene in the most private domain, the house or home. Next, I will look at Marintan's performative strategies, including her understanding of the lived body and relating notions of nature and spirituality. And then finally, I will frame Marintan's approach to the trained and ritualized body as a tool to gain empowerment and bridge to link different spheres of life. Marintan developed her seminal performance installation piece, originally called Kami Sedang Membangun Rumah, from 1994 till the end of the 1990s. Several reinterpretations followed after, with the latest being at the Jakarta Biennial in 2017. The title literally translates to "We are building a house/home." The piece was staged in different variations and often in collaboration with experimental musicians and performers. Its roots, as we have seen yesterday in Amanda Rath's presentation, can be found in the transdisciplinary and collaborative practice of many artists in the 1980s. Now, so-called performance art from Indonesia entered the international stage after becoming an artistic medium in itself beyond experimentation and gaining attention locally in the first half of the 1990s. While Marintan's performative practice was previously built in collaboration with husband artist Andar Maning, Building a House is a solo piece, staged and performed on her own. Marintan was part of a pioneering group of artists who combined aspects of both performance and installation art, which was later described as visual performance art. You will now get a brief impression of Building a House. I will show you a very short video of 2 minutes of Marintan's half-an-hour performance during the opening night of the Second Asia-Pacific Triennial, the APT, in 1996 at the Queensland Art Gallery in Brisbane. Can we go to the next slide? Yeah. So as you saw in this cut video, Building a House is comprised of various parts in which Marintan engages with her body and several materials in different ways. The video starts with Marintan entering the installation she prepared in advance. Little cones or mountains of soil were carefully placed in a pattern-like manner on the floor of the space. The artist installed neon lamps in one corner of the room that were covered with sheets of newspaper buried in soil. There was also torn pieces of newspapers on the walls in the corner, and you could also hear the sound of crickets. Without being able to go into full detail of every section, this piece strikes in its contrast between elements that are meditative, soothing, and parts that give a sense of struggle and vulnerability. For example, her concentrated gesture of making nearly perfect circles with coconut shell ash that is traditionally used for washing dishes evokes the calming atmosphere of repetitive meditation techniques. Also, the rubbing of the ash onto her body can be compared to cleansing rituals. On the contrary, other movements in which her body is hunched over and partly writhed lets us feel a sense of impairment. The same contrast is indicated in her use of materials and objects. The fertility of the soil and the image of the mountain call forth visions of growth and spiritual power. At the same time, the cold light of neon lamps, as well as torn newspapers that were under strict censorship during the New Order, can be associated with restriction, isolation, and artificiality. Marintan's piece at the APT was accompanied by Enin Supriyanto's catalog text, which was a short version of a longer essay that he wrote for another exhibition in Bandung. In his writing, Enin Supriyanto connects building a house with the experience of keteasingan, alienation. Before I continue with Supriyanto's thoughts, I would first like to turn to basic aspects of alienation. According to Rahel Yegi, who critically reviewed the concept of alienation from a social philosophical perspective, the phenomenon of alienation is generally understood as a process of distancing and separation. It is connected to related topics like indifference, internal division, and powerlessness. Alienation refers to the perception of being unable to relate to other human beings, institutions, and oneself. Though not in the sense of an absent relation, but of a broken, deficient one. What we are alienated from is therefore at once alien and our own. An alienated world is a world in which one is not at home and over which one can have no influence. An alienated subject is a stranger to itself and a passive object at the mercy of external forces. By speaking about the relations one has to the world and to the self, Yegi states that both are equally primordial, meaning that if one relation was disturbed, the other one would be as well. Interesting for Marintan's piece is Yegi's assumption that alienation is connected to two differing, however, connected diagnoses, the loss of power and the loss of meaning. In this understanding, alienation can refer to conditions of domination in which the capacity for self-realization and self-determination is absent. In the light of the New Order's repressive regime and its strategic use of spreading terror and fear among its population, Marintan's piece can be read as an experience of, but also resistance to alienation due to conditions of domination. Returning to Supriyanto's thoughts, who not only connected Marintan's practice to alienation, but also in terms of the female body as the other in a patriarchal society. Aspects of gender and implicit hierarchies play a significant role in contextualizing building a house. Conservative gender roles were integral to the New Order's propagated conceptions of marriage and family. From this perspective, Marintan's piece speaks of the home, the last resort of privacy under attack by external forces. For example, the official marriage law stated that all marriages had to include a religious ceremony to be registered by the state. As Marintan and her husband had different religions, they had to go to court to resolve it. According to the artist, only a year later this wasn't possible anymore. Related to marriage, the New Order's vision of the family itself was seen as a site in which its values could be internalized and reproduced to ensure the state formation process. The regime emphasized the husband's role as head of the family and the wives as the ibu rumah, the mothers of the household. By building on previously existing Javanese ideas of gender, women were meant to be obedient to their husbands and defined by their duties as mothers and wives. In the words of political scientist Kate O'Shaughnessy, quote, "In the New Order's vision, obedient citizens, ordered hierarchically according to gender, were part of an eternal nation, led by Suharto as the head of the national family," end quote. Being a mother of 2 little children back then herself, Marintan's practice seems to reflect the regime's structural attempt to exercise control on a micro-political level, the home. As we have seen, building a house refers to the home, the body, the self, under conditions of domination. in which alienation is related to the loss of the capacity for self-realization and self-determination. However, by marking these conditions as artificial and unnatural, Marintan also evokes an opposing vision of the body in relationship to nature and naturalness in different ways, of which I will outline two. First, in Marintan's practice, the natural body is connected to a thorough awareness of the body in motion. It refers to the idea of a natural movement, however, for each individual different. Can we move to the next slide? According to Anida Yoeu, in the mid-1990s, the artist was intrigued by the book The Knowing Body by performer and director Louis Steinman, as it might have spelled out the thoughts that were underlying in her practice, and that might also serve as an example to think about entangled histories. In the first chapter, called The Body as Home, Steinman declares that the unity of mind and body got lost in the modern Western world, and how current performers seek to restore it by using a different awareness for the body in motion. She describes the movement as based on an inner awareness for the lived body and distancing it from practices like ballet that depict the body as perfection. Steinman emphasizes that each body speaks its own native language and that everyone has to find his or her own movement source within oneself. She terms this as one's very own natural movement. Marintan's concentrated gesture of circle making, according to the artist, was the essence of a long period of time trying different body movements, is equivalent to her own native language. The making of circles embodies an archaic movement in which one keeps on coming back to oneself. By finding her body's own native language, the artist is rebuilding her very own inner structure, her home or house. It relates to an open, active process of rebuilding a connection to the self and body and a bodily awareness for being in space and time. Second, the notion of nature and naturalness is also closely linked to ideas of a spiritual, informed balance between the world of nature and humanity. This balance seeks to reconnect with the creative and life-giving power of nature, and though rather indirectly, the female body as well. One of building a house's main elements is earth, that Marintan had formed into little mountains. Mountains being itself a common spiritual symbol in Indonesia, seen among other things as the source of life. As a graduate in the study of ceramics, Marintan seems to bring in her profound knowledge of the transformative quality of soil and an extension, nature and women's life-giving power. While the body in Marintan's practice is presented as a site where conflicts are negotiated, the artist approaches her body as a tool in itself for empowerment. Marintan has repeatedly emphasized that her body is a trained and disciplined body, not only in terms of her studies in dance, ballet, and theater, but also in terms of her practice of Zen rituals, fasting, and meditation techniques. While the embodied practice of Zen rituals mirror Marintan's understanding of how bodily movement and the mental state are bound together, other disciplining rituals like fasting seek empowerment. Contextualizing the ritualist body in Indonesia, Amanda Rath has shown that the concept of kesaktian is evident in fasting rituals, which are specifically crucial for understanding performance art from Indonesia. Kesaktian refers to a traditional pre-Islamic Hinduistic concept of spiritual power or divine presence. It is a concrete power that can be used to influence social and political domains and is accessible with the help of specific practices like fasting rituals. By fasting, one learns to control impulses and needs of the body. The body is emptied of these needs and is formed into a container to create space for named spiritual energy. It's interesting to note is the seeming paradox of subjugation and empowerment, or more specific, the transformation of control and subjugation of the body to empowerment and agency. and the transformation of power from the spiritual realm to other domains, like the social or political one. In conclusion, building a house can be understood as an embodied expression of and resistance to the experience of alienation under the regime of the new order. Marintan's performative practice strikes in its seemingly paradoxical description of non-political activism. It can be read as a way of activism in the sense that it takes up the condition of domination and articulates form of resistance and strategies to regain agency. At the same time, it's non-political as it deals with very personal questions by addressing the self and body to regain the capacity for self-realization. Crucial for the open process of appropriation is Marintan's understanding of the lived body in motion. It consists of an embodied and spiritually informed awareness and is realized in each body's individual natural movement and language. The trained, ritualized body becomes a tool for empowerment and a bridge to link different spheres of life. Thank you.
Should we test the clicker first? Okay. Hello, and thank you for having me, and thank you to all the organizers and all the people who participated in yesterday's performance. I got a lot of energy out of that, and so I want to be thankful to those of you who participated. I want to begin with just sort of positioning a few dates in terms of understanding where I come from and the things that I constantly go back to. And so we begin in the refugee camps in 1979. These are the only images that I have of myself as an artifact from the time, but also as essentially baby photos, except I'm not a baby at this point. I'm about 5 years old. And so I often place these photos at the beginning of my talk to kind of remind myself not only where I come from, but also the ways in which photography serves as a really critical part of who I am and the ways in which photos can fill in lapses in memories and gaps to which you can never recover from. And so the photo often can extend those moments, and you'll see that in my practice. And if you're curious, I am the little red head by the box in the picture on the right. So I've made work with this, and I put this up because Chung Dai-vo is in the audience and curated it into an exhibition. But it was work for me that essentially failed because I was trying to be a visual artist, and I'm not. I'm a performance artist, and this is where visual works fail for me, is that it doesn't have that liveness and that energy that I'm seeking, although artifacts from that kind of performance can engage further, and that has an element of interest for me. So we go back now to current times, which is 2018, and we are now not in the refugee camps. We are in my home, and this is the outside of my house. And I do what I do best, which is I take work and I bring it to people who are around me. And so this piece is called Hello, How Are You? And it is a public art piece, except we didn't have any place to put it, and so we put it in our front yard. So this is a dismantling of the fence that originally was there. This is also a home that is an abandoned house. So we bought it without ever seeing the house online, and essentially it became a whole nother project that nearly ended our collaboration. So please don't ever buy a fixer-upper. And then this quote is really important to me. It comes from Farm Lab outside of LA. It's a Lauren Bond piece, and it says, artists need to create on the same scale that society has the capacity to destroy. I mean, this is a very relevant quote, especially considering the sort of monumental institution that we're in, physically the scale of this place and the scale of what the Nazis tried to do, right? And we're obviously seeing a rise in populism too. And so this quote reminds me of my whole role as an artist, is that the definition of an artist is rooted in creation. And creation is the counter to destruction, and is the counter to violence, and is the counter to war. And so for me, those sorts of politics are intrinsic in who I am and the kind of works that I produce. Whether or not they're overtly political, that's really up to people who are seeing it. But for me, art is political and will always be political, and the body is political. So yesterday, during Nora's talk, she brought up an Ashley Thompson quote that I thought really nailed it for me, that loss as a focus of study, and that we're looking at the conditions in which they disappeared. And she also said that absence is a place of giving, and I think these words up here really, really sort of encapsulate what my work is about, and it's this push and pull between loss as presence. The works that I'm about to kind of flip through really talk about the works as encounters and disruptions, and the ways in which that body is used in these. And so I'm flipping between pieces in Cambodia and the US, and these are also not linear, so I'm also flipping between time here. And the pieces, all these pieces are large scale in that it's just not easy to quickly put together. It takes time, but it's also works that utilize the public space and the public sphere as points of engagement. This is a 24-hour durational piece inviting other artists to participate and sit in the public, allowing random people to basically occupy the seat in the vein of Marina Abramovich to engage with the artist. And this is based on me looking and coming into a Cambodian context in which artists felt like they had to work inside of a studio, and I didn't think that that was necessarily something that I wanted to be essentially a part of. And so this is kind of forcing the artists to come out and sit for an hour over 24 hours to have random people talk to them and engage with them. Other works in Japan, what I like to do is consider the conditions of my own body and how to make work when you're breastfeeding a baby. And I know we have another academic who brought her young baby here, and you know, it's challenging. You get these residencies and you deal with these institutions, and sometimes it doesn't feel like there's a place for you, and you have to really push for you know, work that includes the condition of your body. So for me, I wasn't able to, it wasn't a choice between not taking the residency and not doing the work. It was really, for me, making the institution take the work with everything that comes with that. And so it just happened that this work in Fukuoka was looking at feminist bodies. And so obviously that's leverage, because how could you deny me coming with my baby and family and incorporating my child into this performance? So then there are works that, you know, there's no, rarely any documentation of. And this is a snapshot from someone who gave it to me in Myanmar. And Zonsi, who was here yesterday, was actually one of the witnesses to this. But this was a piece called Push. Underneath the Burmese outfit, I have taped eggs, raw eggs, to my body. The audience has witnessed the taping of the eggs to my body. I then wear the Burmese outfit, and I egg men on to push me until I fall. And it's a huge circle of men, and this was not a piece I was gonna do, but it was a response to the misogyny and to a patriarchy that I was witnessing within the performance scene and that was happening to my fellow Burmese performance artists, women friends. That same piece I then did on an institutional level here. So at Trinity College, where I was a visiting assistant professor, I had the chance to give the distinguished lecture for my title, and I did a similar piece, thinking about the violence at the institution at this point, coming into 2015 with the explosion of Black Lives Matter and other struggles on campus, and issues around faculty of color. And so in this piece, I'm creating a huge line for people to essentially not only push me, but also egg me. And so these are 99 raw eggs, and people get to trash me with the eggs. And I am essentially performing in a church. So it felt like I should be that sacrificial body, that sacrificial lamb, in terms of taking on people's violence. Then you have the fact that my work disappears. So all those pieces you saw only live on in photos. I don't have the big square I made that's 2 meters by 2 meters. I only have the stories that I hold and then the photos. But then you have works that I have created and spent a lot of time creating. I call it performance installation. I heard a word that was used earlier, visual performance art, which is really interesting. And then what you'll notice is that I use a lot of fabric, right? That's meters and meters of textile. And for me, it really is a way for my body to extend into these spaces and to literally pull pieces of my body into other places that it usually can't go. And so with this, you have pieces like this in Chicago. And what's happening here is my work starts to become lost. And I'll explain in a little bit. But this is a piece in which my body is essential. In all my work, my body is the final component to the installation. It activates the space. It allows other things related to time. There's an aspect of a durational aspect to the work, and then there's an engagement. And so here, underneath this cascading hair, I have an open back dress that's made out of old baby diapers. They're Indian cotton diapers that I have stamped time on it, different years from 1979 onwards, obviously indicative of my family history. And then I have fragments of poetry that are written onto my back that are then wiped. And these pieces of history relate to a poem that I was writing about absence and loss and trying to unravel these fragmented memories and pieces that I would see of myself within those sort of 5 years in Cambodia. And so each time the person writes the words, she would wipe it and then write the next fragment of work, and it's a kind of palimpsest that's created over time where you can't quite erase what's been written, you can only write on top of it more. Unfortunately, the entire dress was killed, destroyed by laundry detergent. So toxic laundry detergent completely tore apart the dress that I don't have anymore. Then you have this work here, which is essentially confronting Islamophobia in America early on here in 2010. And then death by vandalism, because somebody decided to ruin my work. This was my MFA thesis work. Nora was one of the only professors who stood up for the work. So thank you, Nora. But it was vandalized, and so that work was destroyed, and we had to sort of reclaim it with the help of the community to restain the wall instead of leaving it with the graffiti. Then you have, in Cambodia, I started creating these sort of mythical heroines with the dresses. And this was my attempt to find beauty in displacement. I think that for me is the real struggle here. It's not about unearthing trauma. It really is about trying to find joy and beauty and doing it in a way that sort of honors my practice. And so these were attempts for me early on in composition. Once I arrived in Cambodia, I realized how actually liberating it was for me to not deal with identity politics and the burden of representation. And so I tried some things out, like performing and allowing the wind to sculpt and create these moments. I also tried to perform in abandoned spaces and create multiple selves. So these are all stitched together later on in Photoshop to create these multiple characters. And with this dress, death by rust and flooding, because I lived in Cambodia. And this dress has wires to create that sort of shape, and unfortunately it was destroyed in one of the monsoons because we didn't lift the storage box up. Then you have this beautiful dress, which is one of my favorite dresses, and you're about to see its slow death here. This is a dance in the rice field, and this is my attempt again, compositionally and dance-wise, to take straight lines out into the rice field. And you do see a version of it installed. And then, death by 10,000 termites. The dress is made of linen, and it was stored in a humid area and didn't realize how humid it was, opened the box to get shipped to another place, and thousands of termites were eating my linen dress. So I had, with this one, because it was going to another exhibit overseas, I had to quickly remake the dress. So the dress survives in reincarnation, except I refuse to look at the dress, and I just have this ache and this feeling of great loss from the original dress, because the new dress is not linen, because you can't source the same material in Cambodia. So then you have this dress. This dress is made of, I would say, 30 to 40 sarongs based on my travel. I am an ethnically mixed person, Thai, Khmer, Cham, and Malay. And this, during my travels between, I would say, 2003 onwards, I was collecting all these sarongs because I felt this is the one item that really connects my family lineage. And I finally was able to make a dress out of it. This beautiful cascading dress. This is the only photo I have of it because it was taken for a piece in a magazine. And unfortunately, death by fire. It was stored at one of the galleries in Cambodia, and it was in their backroom storage, and unfortunately, it caught on fire, the entire place. And so the dress is gone. It is a great loss. The Red Chador, 2015 to 2018, a very short-lived performance piece addressing Islamophobia and the fear of the other in a really, the way that I like to go out, which is really fabulous. It is a Muslim woman in what is essentially her debut dress, you know, her ball gown, her prom dress. And here she's traveling around the world, and I mean, there's a lot more to be said about this piece, but I'm going to flash through it so you can see the different iterations of the work, because there's always an installation component, and then there's the actual performance of her in different spaces, in the public spaces of the cities that she's been in, including San Francisco. and she also performed right when Donald Trump was announced president. It was the day after. And she went out to Seattle, and this is in the vein of the 1960s protest signs. And then in Hong Kong, this is a homage to the umbrella movement. And then her final appearance was at the KL Biennale last year before she took a flight to Palestine. So in Ramallah, I traveled with the garments there, and I was able to get in to Palestine where I was giving a talk. Unfortunately, I was strip searched before getting on. Managed to get into the country, managed to get out of the country, but sadly, my luggage, which had the original costume, was taken. And I know this because there were 2 luggages that went, and only 1 luggage came back, and it was a smaller luggage. It had nothing important, but the larger luggage with costume was gone, and when we tracked it, the last place it was scanned in was Tel Aviv. I was flying from Tel Aviv to Istanbul, to Chicago, to Seattle. It didn't make it back to me ever. She is dead. And so December 2nd, 2017 was the last time I saw her at Ben Gurion Airport. And I really believe that it was an enforced disappearance. This is a tool that has been used in many countries. And I acknowledge that, when one engages in seemingly political work, that you will be watched, and things will happen. And so I had 3 exhibitions coming up with the Red Chador, and at this point, I'm actually very sad, and I kind of don't know what to do. And usually I'm very good at responding, but this time it hit me really hard because, it was an expansive project. It wasn't meant to go away quite yet. I didn't mean for her to leave me. I didn't want her to leave me. And so what I decided to do was, I had stumbled upon this quote from the conference in Ramallah by the Palestinian national poet Mahmoud Darwish. Memorials have consistent rituals. They always start with the past tense. And I just felt like, wow, that really resonates with me and what I'm trying to do and sort of my practice and my life. And so what I decided to do is give her an official eulogy and do memorial exhibitions in tribute to her disappearance. And so in all of the pieces, I start to create her death in meaningful rituals. And it even comes down to writing an obituary. So I hire a journalist to write an obituary for her that gets translated into Khmer, French, and Arabic. And I publish a newspaper of only obituaries that are, that give her sort of an extended moment, an extended life. And I also enact my own ritual to kind of give myself as the performing artist some closure. And this is both a burial and a cremation, because the only remnants I have are the little samples of her garment, which happen to be in Cambodia, safely kept by the gallery owner whose gallery burned my other dress. So sort of nice little comeback. Essentially, we now come back to the Buddhist bug, which is the work you saw down there. And I'm putting this out there, identities in flux, the insider, outsider. This is something this is something that is part of the diasporic dilemma, that you're constantly fluctuating between insider, outsider. You don't have a choice of that. It sort of kicks in at different moments. And with the Buddhist bug, it's really about coming to terms with creating from a place of empowerment and using that in between as a place of creation. Just going back to the quote that I mentioned early on about art being rooted in that. And so I'm part of the returning diaspora in Cambodia, and I fully believe that this current scene is intrinsically linked to that returning diaspora and a kind of transnationalism, that is a collaboration to create the contemporary art scene into what it is, and to create a contemporary Cambodia that includes those of us who left and those who remained, and then those who have returned by choice and by force. What you're looking at are a group of returnees. They are deported individuals who, for the most part, are Americans, except for their citizenship, but because they committed a felony, were deported after serving their sentences in US prisons. These are my friends, and these are the people who also have given me a lot in their own loss. I'm not able this time around to talk about my film work with Studio Revolt. You can look that up, but we have a series of deportation videos and a documentary film called Cambodian Sun, which is also a joke because it's the only son that my husband and I will ever have together, because we have only daughters. So with this, I wanted to put this out there because this, I haven't shown this piece, and this is something we shot right before leaving Cambodia to return to the US after 5 years of residency. But this is the Buddhist bug, and you've seen it below, and I'm gonna end with just kind of reading this little bit. I have been fortunate enough to return to Cambodia after 30 years of absence, to take residency and ultimately make art and make my most ambitious work, the Buddhist Bug series. It is poetic that I would return as an adult to live and work in Cambodia for exactly 5 years, the same amount of time I had spent as a small child before my family fled as refugees from the Khmer Rouge. I have been chasing those 5 years of my childhood, haunted by fractured memories and wondering who I would have been had we not been forced to leave. I have come to realize we didn't choose to leave. The leaving chose us. This shift in thinking about our exodus has empowered me to heal and make meaningful art. I believe performing narratives is an act of social engagement that contributes to collective healing. For me, performance and storytelling become ways of bridging the interior and exterior space of self, as well as initiate critical dialogues between communities and institutions. From daylight to nightfall, inside classrooms and outside amusement parks, along stairwells and street corners, the bug appears, present, visible, and curious. I have never been able to quietly create works inside a studio space. That is a luxury I have never had. Instead, my works are performances taken into the streets and rice fields, classrooms and hawker stands, energetic sites where everyday people and daily life occur. Only after these site-specific performances does the work return as photographic or cinematic artifacts, works of art that are then shared inside and outside of Cambodia. Set intentionally among school children, an ox cart driver, a Muslim fishing village, and random people in a busy alleyway, my works engage everyday people in an effort to include them into conversations rarely afforded them in the context of contemporary art. So the Buddhist bug lives, but in segments and in what an earlier person, I think it was Nora again, this idea of deliberate fragmentation. So that is where I will end.
I just check, Ever, how much time have we got? 10 minutes more than that? Or 10 minutes to the... can we go slightly after? Okay. Great. So thank you so much for your presentations. The diversity of the practices and the depth of the research makes, I think, for a very rich conversation that we're about to have. So just to kick things off, because here, this particular panel, I had a lot of, it was a challenge trying to work through how to phrase the title of this panel, because once you name the word identity, it raises all these tropes that circulate when we're talking about work, in particular to certain types of artists on the global stage. And I really, I think Ever myself were contesting the very title of it, even as we were trying to write the title. So I want to kind of open up that question a little bit more beyond representation, because that is, again, a very oft discussed paradigm. So here instead I want to kind of open up and say, in the works that you were discussing, how do you think, or is it productive to think about, rather than the representation of the artist straightforwardly as in the artist representing a certain kind of identity, whether instead there is a kind of use of a stand-in or a further extension, or do you know what I mean? Like a substitute somehow that is at work to represent something that perhaps is unrepresentable, something that's beyond like the mere representation itself. And I just wonder whether you could basically sort of, we'll go down the line and hear your thoughts.
I just first have to think about it.
Okay. Or maybe the other way around.
I'll try to answer that question. When I spoke to Harsono actually on Monday, but precisely kind of not questioning, but having a dialogue about his artistic strategies and talking about Chinese Indonesians. So there's this interesting turn in his practice whereby he's very, if you like, obsessively collecting a lot of materials. And then he used this over and over again in the past couple of years in his various installations and performances. So these are old photographs and also objects that has particular resonances with the history of Chinese Indonesians. But I guess to kind of thinking about the substitute is that I feel that in the artist's attempt in collecting and archiving, it's this obsessiveness that I notice as opposed to his attempt of representation. So it's almost like the interest in collecting that's an extension of the loss that he himself experienced as a Chinese Indonesian, if you like. And so that's something that I kind of look into when I'm reading his work, if you like. And I suggested this to him, and he said that he believes that it's precisely because he does things that can make people remember, hence the title of my presentation. Things happen when we remember. So he keeps pushing that idea. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but it's kind of responding to that.
Yeah. So in a way, in a sense, he isn't trying to represent, as in word for word, this is what happened in history, but more the obsessive collecting itself is an extension of the deeply felt loss, and a sense that that's not completely recuperated, that is like cyclical with the obsession itself.
That's a good observation. But also, I think because the politics of identity in Indonesia particularly really depends on the change of political regimes. And so this is, I think, what the artist is grappling to understand as well, in terms of his position as one of the artists who often represent Indonesia in the global forum, but at the same time also trying to give back to or mentor. He's actually quite a well-known figure in terms of mentoring young artists in Indonesia. So it works in both ways.
Mm-hmm. And then I guess maybe Sally, if you could pick that up with Marintan.
So I think Marintan wouldn't see her practice as connected to the big topic of identity, and also, as mentioned from Anida, the burden of representation. I think she would also see it as a concept that is too closed or too big, and I think her practice is very much based on the process. It's very important because this piece was developed since the 80s and into the 90s, and it changed regarding single details, but the core was the awareness for the body in motion and the very performative quality of it. And I think maybe in terms of stand-in or extension, I think it's more about subjectivity and agency, actually.
And I guess maybe Anida, if you could comment on that too.
I think representation is useful. I think that many artists, especially artists from marginalized communities with marginalized bodies, often have to go through it. It's almost like a box that you have to explore for yourself, but that same box, you don't realize that you don't have to be inside that box, that box you can actually stand on it, you can trample it, you can break it apart, you can throw it away, you can burn it. You know, like I think that's what I'm interested in, is that it is useful, and it continues to be useful. It will continue to be, because we will always have marginalized voices and bodies. And so I think it's just a starting point, and it can't be reductive.
And I think, it's interesting because there's a few things here. I think we talked about the politics of trauma and loss, I think, Wulan, in your presentation. And I think you were speaking about this more processual idea of evoking identity, which perhaps is also reflected in the obsessive collecting. And I just wonder whether through this, there was something in there. I think there was a reference, I think you made to Hindu ritual. And I think in terms of also the aesthetic of the Buddhist bug, there is a kind of, I was shocked, not shocked, but like taken aback by how physically enduring it was to be posed like that within the body of the suit, and to, in a way, have to stay in a particular mindset as well throughout that whole positioning. And I just wonder whether through these three descriptive projects, where there was a sense of language when we were tussling with about trying to recuperate something, but at the same time being alienated from something. Is it useful to think about other frameworks of linguistics and representation in terms of like spirituality or Hindu-Buddhist traditions? Is that useful at all?
Well, I think for Marintan's case, it's absolutely crucial. It's such a big aspect of her practice, and as seen in Amanda Rath's research, also for other practice in Indonesia, and also, of course, the understanding of the cultural understanding of the body. So I think, it's very important.
It's quite interesting because you talked about the little mounds as representative of mountains. For me, I guess, because of the training I had, when I looked at them, they looked like votive stupas, and the kind of meditative perambulation around it. Yeah.
So Marintan, I think she defines herself as a mix of Buddhist and other religions. So I think this is totally valid, actually.
I think for my work, I'm definitely interested in hybridity and transcendence within these bodies. And I'm definitely using religious aesthetics to provoke. And for me, it is about trying to establish a new political and spiritual landscape, one that can sort of reappropriate these aesthetics into something else, into something other. So with the Buddhist bug, it is a hybrid creature, it is a hybrid imaginative place of being where the Muslim and the Buddhist can coexist, and they coexist through my realization of what is essentially an imagined possibility right now. And with the red chador, as well as the Buddhist bug, those are also, for me, queer bodies. Those are not just a he or a she, but that they're fluid, they're gender fluid. It's seldom that you'll see the red chador's face, and even if you see it, you'll always see it as the stoic face. I don't have any makeup on, whatever it is, I'm not trying to feminize those bodies. It's very important for me to establish that, especially utilizing these religious aesthetics, because it's part of what I'm trying to create is a sense of a new kind of spirituality that we can inhabit together.
So I was thinking about an article by Flodet Datuin, who's actually talking about embodied spirituality when looking at specific Southeast Asian women artists and proposing kind of in quotation, a feminist approach where the body is not only seen as defined by its anatomical characteristics, but the body is a side of as a social, psychic, and spiritual side. So I think that's actually some very interesting thoughts I would also like to follow up.
In terms of linguistic approach, yeah, sure. I mean, the thing that I'm particularly interested in terms of how the practices of the artists use the term trauma, and so first I have this long discussion with them. But also then I'm also interested in terms how linguistically looking how trauma itself is being deployed in the socio-cultural environment around the artist. So thinking about then how the practices use, adopt, and utilize the term trauma. Because it's I guess it's trauma itself has no, if you like, Indonesian equivalent. So Indonesians use the term trauma, which is an Anglicized version of that. But as I, talk with the artists and also, try to understand the more of the social, cultural, and kind of linguistic approaches, it's more that trauma has a local inflections. It does exist, but it exists in various kind of local language and local dialect in which the symptoms which we understand as trauma or even post-traumatic stress disorder, but the terms itself entered the Indonesian mainstream as a Western psychic medical discourse. And that was, I think it's interesting to think about how that ideas of a Western thinking then entered the Indonesian consciousness, and how artists, practicing artists and even scholars use the term to kind of explain the impact of historical violence, if you like, in the practice, the aftermath of it. Yeah.